So this video is for artist folks who have some experience with HTML or JavaScript and have some understanding of what code is, but who haven't gotten into making stuff like this yet because either it involves an insane amount of code, or when really cool libraries like three.js exist, the documentation isn't so great, and you end up having to be the kind of person that scours through source code just to make sense of it all. You have to be part of what Ted Nelson calls the computer priesthood, who are folks who have had some access to information which really isn't that complicated, but has, for whatever reason, been mysticized for the rest of us. So if you're not a programmer, and thus not part of the computer priesthood, but you have some web savvy, and more importantly, you're digitally creatively inclined, then this is for you. My name is Nick Briz, and I'm a new media artist slash educator slash organizer living and working in Chicago, Illinois. And I made this quick sketch behind me using something that we at Briz developed called the three.js playground. You're watching a tutorial slash essay video on how to also make sketches like this by playing in the playground. So what is the three.js playground? Three.js playground is 1, a digital literacy, which is to say agency tool, and 2, an introduction to three.js slash webGL, which is interactive and generative 3D animation in the browser. And this tool slash playground as software slash artware is modeled after 3, an experimental new media art ethic. So there are 4 main areas in the playground. The 0th area is the documentation, including this tutorial. And if you're watching this on YouTube, this might be a good time to navigate over to three.jsplayground.brangerbriz.net. The first area is the graphical interface for learning and generating some basic geometry. The second area is the real-time editor, which is a sort of live coding environment. And the third area is the archive. So after you make a sketch by playing in the playground, you can add it to this sort of xenologically inspired archive. So I mean ethics not in the traditional moral sense, but in the general sense, as a set of principles for practice in accordance with some convention. In this case, the practice is a new media art one. So rather than traditional approaches to programming centered around best practices and conventions like these, it's instead modeled on new media ethics like these. So here's what the first step looks like. Go ahead and click on number 1, the graphics to code interface. And the first thing you should see is a 3D cube. This is being rendered with webGL, which stands for Web Graphics Library, using the three.js library. So some browsers aren't so good at keeping up to date with the internet, specifically Internet Explorer. So if you don't see this cube, you'll see an error instead with some information. This is not a big deal. You just need to download a modern browser like Firefox or Chrome, and in this case, Chrome seems to be working best. So, in addition to the cube, you'll see some code to the left and a graphical menu to the right, also known as a GUI, which stands for Graphical User Interface, which is normally how we interact with computers. So traditionally, GUIs obfuscate code, so in the interest of making something more accessible, it hides the code, and as a result, compromises digital literacy. In our case, the GUI is still concerned with accessibility, but in a way that augments the code instead of obfuscating it, which is cool for folks like us who prefer some agency in our digital realms, because we want to be able to make stuff. So this code on the left is JavaScript code, which uses the super rad three.js library to generate real-time hardware-accelerated 3D graphics in the browser. So this is the basic code you need to create a mesh or a 3D object in three.js. The first line says create a new cube geometry with some parameters. The second line creates a new material, which is the skin that wraps around your geometry. And then the third line creates a new mesh, which is the combination of the previously stated geometry and material. And then the last line just adds that mesh to your scene or your sketch. Over in the menu, there's a drop-down with different geometry options, and when you pick different geometry from the list, a new menu with the parameters for that specific geometry opens up. When you adjust the sliders for these parameters, you'll notice that the code on the left changes in real time. So you'll notice that this first parameter changes when I adjust the radius slider. So that's what that number does. And likewise with these other sliders, you can see how they correspond to the parameters in the code. If you want to get this menu out of the way, you can close it, and then later you can open it back up when you want to by clicking Open Geometry. I'm going to switch back to the cube though for this example. Likewise, the materials drop-down list changes your material. The basic material is pretty basic, like the name implies. And there's these other 2 materials, Lambert and Fong, which have a few more parameters, which shades it in response to any lights you add to your scene. But we'll stick to the basic parameter for this example. Just like the geometry menu lets you edit your mesh's geometry's parameters, the materials menu lets you edit the parameters of your material. So you can change the color, or you can make it a wireframe. You could also make it transparent and adjust the opacity. There's also an option to add a texture to your mesh. So you can choose from this drop-down list of some preloaded textures, or you can click custom texture, and then in this input field you can paste any URL to any image on the web. I'm going to use this iPhone jailbreaking screenshot as my texture. So notice that as I adjust stuff in this menu, any changes I make are being reflected in the code. This is important to keep an eye on because this is how you get a sense for what each line in the code does. There's a few more menus here, which I won't go into too much detail in this example, but I'll just go over it real quick. There's a plane menu, which lets you generate a wireframe plane like this, or you could also generate a solid plane with some of those preloaded textures like this. Also, there's an environment menu for adding fog or changing the background color. And then there's also this lights menu for adding different kinds of lights into your scene. As soon as you start to toggle these, the code for your light objects gets rendered here. Then, just like the geometries and materials menus, you get a menu to adjust all the parameters for each one of these lights that you add to your scene. But like I mentioned before, your mesh's material has to be set to either Lambert or Phong if you want it to shade in response to any lights that you add to your scene. And we're using the basic material, so lights are kind of pointless here, so I'm just going to remove all of them for this example. So once you're happy with your object, and I think I am, click on the code menu at the top, and then click select code. And this is going to select all the code that you've generated. Then go ahead and click Command C to copy that code and move on to step 2, which is the editor.